Hey, all you Ethicuties, welcome to session 2 of Ethicsverse Day. A couple of quick announcements and we're going to dive right in. Today's session, or session 2, is all about getting a seat at the table. This is going to be our leaders toolkit on how we can expand our influence and communicate better to really expand our impact within our organization. A couple of quick housekeeping items and we're going to dive right in. In between sessions, or at the end of the session, we're going to stick around and answer any questions we are not able to get to. So keep that chat flowing. We got a little competition going because we hit 5,900 emojis in the last episode. So we're going to see if we can blow by that this one. So keep those emojis coming, keep those comments coming, and drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. If you haven't connected with anyone, I encourage you to do that today. Your network is your network. Neither are big enough. As always, the world famous Ethico Ethicsverse book giveaway is in full effect today. So for this session, we're giving away 15 books. Who loves you? These are all the books you can pick from. Several of our speakers throughout Ethicsverse Day have books here. You can see that Lisa Beth Lentini Walker's book is up here, which is called Raise Your Game, Not Your Voice. And so if you don't have these, you can click this box here, or, you know what I'm saying, take a picture of this QR code and find these on Amazon. You should have all these on here, but yeah, check those out. And then also, I just want to shout out a couple of my favorite podcasts that are in my rotation. Hema Lomax is the host of the Great Women in Compliance podcast. You know, I don't know how anyone can do a podcast in this space with what they're putting out every single week. Literally every single one, I get something that I can take back to my team. And so if that's not in your rotation, if you have not subscribed to that, I would encourage you to do that. And then also check out the FCPA Survival Guide with me and Tom Fox. It's a 10-part series. Episode 7 just posted on YouTube. It's about a 10 or 15 minute episode where we're talking about lesson 10 from the FCPA Survival Guide. Also, one last thing before I pass it over to the coolest guy in compliance, we got prize packs, okay? So if you come to all 3 sessions or you reshare a post about Ethicsverse Day, you'll be entered in to win one of these prize packs. It's got the FCPA Survival Guide in it. It's got a really cool hoodie and one other surprise. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to the one and only Matt Kelly. Round of applause for Matt Kelly, coolest guy in compliance, best panel host I've ever seen in my life. How's it going, Matt?
Pretty good, Nick. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here today. I understand that we have, I think, about 4 million people who have joined the webinar as attendees. That's great. So we are here to talk about how to be an influencer and a leader in your organization. And we have a great panel. I'm going to introduce them. Calling up the cyborg images in no particular order. First, we had Nick, co-CEO of Ethico. Everybody knows that. Lisa Beth Lentini Walker, who is at Marquetta. Then next, we have, who is our next one? Hema Lomax, who is running compliance at Zendesk. And then lastly, Melanie Sponholz, and Melanie is over at WAD Capital Partners, which is
winner of Mentor of the Year. Okay, so let's not let that one pass by. Mentor of the Year.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay?
Thanks, Nick.
So given that everybody is looking to dive into this conversation, I will just start right away. Our point with this was really to cover how a compliance professional gains influence in the organization and sort of can be a leader as opposed to just somebody who is compliance focused and, the in-house fun police and all the other snide names that we know about the compliance team, none of which should be true. So I just wanted to start with a very broad-based question for our 3 panelists. And then while everybody else is listening, if you do have questions throughout the hour, of course, pop them into the attendee chat or the Q&A function. We'll try and work them in. But I just wanted to ask each panelist to even explain, what do we mean by influencer? Why is that important on a practical daily basis for a compliance officer? I will start, I guess, by asking first Lisa Beth, then Hema, and then Melanie, solely because that was the order of your cyborg images a while back. But give us the take on, why are we talking about this? Why is it important not just to be a good compliance officer, but to be an influencer? What does that mean? Lisa Beth, let's start with you.
One of the things that I always say is being right is never enough. Being right is table stakes. But in order to get people to do the right thing, you have to be able to get them to see what it means to them and why it matters to them personally and why it matters to the organization as a whole, right? If you are right and no one is listening, you have no impact. So in order to have impact and influence, and that is what we're trying to do, we're trying to help good people make better risk-informed decisions and do the right thing. In order to do that, we have to be able to navigate that space between what the right answer is and how to get the right outcome. And so I think this is one of the most powerful skills that any person can have, whether you're in compliance and ethics or whether you're in any other part of the organization. This is crucial to future success everywhere.
Hema, give me your thoughts, maybe including, I'll put an extra spin on the question now, like, is this hard to do, to be an influencer? Like, is this an acquired skill that compliance officers have to practice? What would you say?
Look, 100% it's hard to do, but the wonderful thing about what we do as ethics professionals is we do hard things well together with our business partners. And so I think that's one real definition of an influencer is how do you face the hard things? Come to work and do the easy things, sure. But the chances are if you've chosen this profession, you know you've not come for just that. So that's number one. I want to also talk about the power. You know, we take on a lot of responsibility. And I like to say with responsibility comes great power, right? The other way around. And we have a lot of power to have impact at scale as influencers. We want to think a lot more about what impact at scale our business partners can have, good or bad, rather than just the activities we can nudge them along to do. What impacts can we have? And so that's what I think is one definition of power and influence for us. The other one I like to say, Matt, is, you know, people generally are good and they have good intentions, but we're there to help operationalize those good intentions. Just pausing there for a second, what does that mean? It's very easy to talk about what we should be doing and what we want to be doing and what we want to be known for doing. But the practical fact is, if you've been in-house, you know, it just isn't that easy. It takes lots of systems. Lots of things can fail. It takes humans on a daily basis making decisions in their own kind of journey. And so I like to think about how we can influence those journeys, how we can influence people to know that there is often a better way to operationalize their good intentions and to guide them on that path as a coach. So yeah, that's my definition of influencer, but I'd love to hear more, and I'm sure we'll learn more as we go through today.
Well, Melanie, let me now put it on to you. What would you say about why being an influencer is important?
Well, I mean, when I was, listening to Hema and Lisabeth, it's interesting because, I would consider both of them in my circle of influence, right? They're people that I go to when I have a question, and there's a lot of folks like that in our compliance circles. And so I was just thinking as they were speaking, and Lisabeth said being right is just table stakes, right? It's like, how do you get beyond that to get the influence? And if you think about who are the people in, say, your personal life who you would say have influence over you, it's people who, listen well, right? They make you feel seen and understood. They're people that you trust, they're people that you like. And I think all of that is crucial to be someone who is influential as a compliance professional, because I think, as you said, you don't want to be the Department of No, or sometimes we do face, depending on people's past experiences with compliance in their career, that bias that we're going to be a wet blanket in the situation, or that we're somehow the law, impressions like that. If you can make people feel seen and heard and understood, then that is how you get your influence. So take the time to listen to people and understand what they need, what they're trying to do, what their personality is. And then when the chips are down and you need them to do something for you, you're going to have the influence you need because you took the time to do that.
I'd even like to put a practical angle on this. It occurs to me you have to be good as an influencer, because it's not like a compliance officer will succeed otherwise. You don't have the resources. I know some very big compliance or companies where their compliance function is the compliance officer and maybe an intern and a passcode to the photocopier. And they can't do the job unless they influence. Number one, is that fair to say? It's like there is no alternative. But I was also wondering, is this even something that, say, regulators would look at? I don't know if anybody has gone through that or talked with regulators. But I'm even curious, when they evaluate a compliance program, do they say influencer, yes or no? And if they scratch it off, you're in a big trouble if you're not. I mean, what about some of those more practical challenges? What would you all, I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to take a shot at it.
Well,
Yeah, I'd like to say
funny.
something. One point is, sorry to interrupt you, Mel. Excuse me.
That's okay, Nick, anytime.
But I think, like, what Mel described as, Lisa Beth said, Mel, you kind of brought that all home. And the essence of influence, the essence of persuasion is, are those elements of trust, having, if somebody feels heard, like you said. And I think most like archetypal people in this space are already wired that way, first of all. So we're not starting from like in a hole. And then if you can reframe this whole conversation and recognize that, again, all of the things that we're talking about are all inherently in us. When we're babies, we are persuasion machines. You know what I'm saying? We are influence machines when we're babies and we're kids, and we have no problem asking for it and asking for it again and again and again. Like, my kids are like salespeople. I mean, it's absolutely wild. And again, like a crying baby, that's a highly influential mechanism. And so if we can recognize that we already have these things in us, that the ingredients for influence are already utilized naturally outside of work, it's really about just unleashing those qualities and those characteristics within the four walls of your organization and setting an example to the rest of your team, so that your department, the sum total of those behaviors and interactions with the organization are in line with that vision you have for, connection and for trust.
Melanie,
and I didn't even answer your question, Matt. How'd you like that? Sorry.
Very skillful.
So I do think, Matt, back to what you were asking, that the regulators do think about it. So, right now I'm working on an article about program effectiveness and how do you document program effectiveness. And as I'm looking at all of the resources and, reading what's been out there expressed by various regulators, I mean, I think one way that you can see if there's influence is kind of level setting and comparing the compliance leader to their peers in the organization. So, are they included in, the room where it happens? And now I'm singing Hamilton in my head now, can't help myself. But if they're, in the meetings where the COO is and the CFO and the chief marketing officer and the CEO, are they, on the same pay scale as everyone else? Do they get the same commensurate resourcing as the company grows, as other departments do? I mean, I think those are all pretty objective measurements of whether or not there's influence or they're sat in a silo somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I would add to that, Mel, that I think that regulators have just been kind of circling around this by using coded words, like you have a paper program, which means that you have something that looks good on paper, but really the influence isn't there. The actual impact isn't there. And so I think they've been talking about it using coded words and a whole host of other things. And they look for certain hallmarks, but then they say, like, let's test those hallmarks. Is this really happening? Yeah, you can put the compliance officer at the table, but is anybody following what they're saying? And if the answer is no, then that's where you see so many programs go wrong.
All right.
I'll add too, Matt. So, I used to work at the SEC for 11 years, and while I can't speak for them officially, one thing we always looked for was things that got in the way of influence. So it may be the absence of real reporting lines. You can have a dotted line in form or in substance, and I think the regulators are looking to make sure that was, again, operationalized. It was actually happening in reality rather than just on paper. So thinking about things that can get in the way, we looked at things like minutes of audit committee meetings and board meetings to see just how much time was given and what questions were asked. So there's things like that I think you can think about, and holistically, what can you do to make sure that the influence isn't being stalled or, siloed is one word, but also just the voice isn't getting up and isn't being operationalized. I think that's something that we can all think about better when we're revising our C-suites and E-suites.
All right, so the next question I had wanted to ask was a bit about to have influence, you must have the rest of the business trust that this compliance officer knows what I do, they know my pressures, and they will interact with me or they'll listen to me when I speak up, and okay, then I'll do them a favor if they ask me something. So really, that is a long-winded way of saying for compliance officers to gain influence, they must first know the business. which is one of the most cliched phrases around, although it is true that you must. So I was also hoping for some practical advice and tips about what should compliance officers do at that bridge building phase, the trust building phase, to be able to get to know the business. And I will throw that out. I mean, maybe Hema, I'll start with you again, and then Melanie, and then Lisa Beth. Like, what would you advise people to try to do to roll up their sleeves and get to know the business?
So it's absolutely imperative that you want to know the business you're working for. At the same time, we want to have a bit of humility as well and understand that we're not ever going to know the business as well as our front line. And so instead, another phrase that Nick and I like to use, we want to crowdsource risk intelligence. What does that mean? That means leveraging radical curiosity, compassion, empathy, listening, seeking to understand rather than ever thinking you're going to learn it and know, because the business moves faster than you ever will. So if you can seek to understand, leverage the strengths of those on the front line, make sure you've got that communication line open so that you are building trust, then you will be brought into those conversations. The other piece is you're not just there to learn and then advise. You're there to almost in a coaching position, take in the information and then also seek information and input on how we can best practically mitigate the risks we identify. Most of the time, the best controls are ones that have come from the people that I'm trying to help. But they're the ones that have the better ideas, practically what will work. Again, the only other thing is, remember, it's a journey. We don't want to just learn, think we've arrived, and then we're done. We have to put our business partners on a journey and go with them. And so that is, I think my favorite phrase there is your maturity journey. Where are we on the maturity journey? And how can we mitigate risk on a journey? So a number of practical things I try to do to make sure that we're on a ride along, we're there learning with them, but also having the humility to understand that we might never know what's coming tomorrow, but we'll equip them with the skills, teach them to fish rather than just give the fish every time we see an issue.
You know, I would say I love your point about the best controls often come from the business. And if we want the business to own the risk and own the control, which we do, that's the best practice. We all say that's how you do it. And I just wanted to call out that point. Melanie, let's go to you next, and then Lisa Beth, and then Nick. Like, what else would you recommend to sort of build that culture, that foundation of trust, and to learn the business and make sure people know, okay, this compliance officer, they're for real?
Well, I mean, I've spent the last probably 12, 13 years working in some kind of private equity role because I was with a private equity owned business. And then now I work for a private equity firm. And so I do a lot of diligence and then integration. And so just practically speaking, from repeatedly getting to know new businesses and trying to establish what I want the culture and the relationship with the compliance officer to be, I think one of the most helpful things is I had a good friend and mentor give me a book called The First 90 Days once when I started a new role. And it really talks about, those first 90 days, you really need to be kind of a sponge. Like, you don't want to walk in and before you've spent any time getting the lay of the land, start making recommendations and giving orders. You really want to soak in the culture and learn as much about an organization as you can, because they will appreciate that, and it will make a big difference, both in getting to the point where, as Hema said, you can get some of those solutions from the front lines because they're willing to talk to you, because they feel like you have taken the time to spend time with them and see how things really work, not just, like you can read a lot in a data room, but when you go spend time with the people who are doing the work, you're going to have a completely different perspective on how an organization works and probably what their risks are, which goes back to Hema's crowdsourcing too, right? Like, that's what makes Waze different from Google Maps, is that there's someone saying, hey, there's a pothole on this road, or there's construction going on over here. And if you don't take the time to get to know where the potholes are first, and you just start giving ivory tower advice based on what the policy says is going on, you lose your credibility. So I think it really is taking the time, spend time with people who are doing the work so that you have relationships and credibility when you start making recommendations.
So, Lisa Beth, let me also put that same question to you. And maybe, again, I'll put a little bit of extra spin on it. I wholly agree with the idea that compliance officers should at first slow down and listen. But I also sometimes wonder, how often do managements sort of have high expectations that you're supposed to hit the ground running and you're supposed to solve all my compliance problems right now, and it's already 30 days in? What's going on? Like, is that a risk?
That's always a risk.
How do you get around it? And what else would you advise for compliance officers at that sort of early stage of engaging with a new company?
So I'll take that in a little bit different direction, because while it's really important to be a voracious student of your business and your industry, whatever that may be, and lucky for us as compliance professionals, we can go to lots of different industries and be very useful. What I would say is, I think one of the things that we need to do is to use psychology and use bias to our benefit. And Nick and I had a long conversation about bias isn't bad. Bias is what keeps us alive. But use things like affinity bias to connect with people and find ways to string the things that are common and your likability along, so that A, they're not overly harsh in terms of expecting you to know everything. They like you, so they want to help you. And you are able to have more influence. So I think that one of the things we really need to do is say, like, how can we be alike and connect really deeply very early? Because the more they see you as one of us, in addition to the responsibilities you have to be independent, et cetera, the more likely you are to get the help all the way along the line and be given the benefit of the doubt. When you say, hey, to put together a whole program soup to nuts, it's going to take at least 9 months, a year before we can get to all of these big projects. We have to do it, in a logical sequence. They will give you the benefit of the doubt if they like you and believe that you are one of them and working together collaboratively.
All right. Nick, what would you say to all this?
I'd say that was phenomenal. That's like 10 clips we just got from those 3 answers. So that was great. The thing that I would add is, to kind of dovetail off of what Lisa Beth just said, is like, how do we create that affinity bias? What's our mechanism and our catalyst to create that affinity bias within them? I think the best hack for that is what I call the mentee chair hack. So everybody, if you divided the world up into smart people and dumb people, let's say it's 50-50. 99% of people think they're in the smart people bucket, right? I sure think I am. So everybody also likes to give advice. And so one of the best things you can do when you're new or when you're trying to, conquer some new influence ground is to create a mentee situation where you go to this person and say, hey, I'm new, or hey, I don't know enough about your business, and then ask a how or a what question. How or what questions are very open questions that when sitting in that mentee chair, you're going to get a lot of insight, and you're going to subconsciously ingratiate yourself to that individual. You're going to get some insights, so you're not going to waste your time chasing after a phantasm, and you're going to help build some of that affinity bias, because you're like demonstrably trying to be one of them, as Lisa Beth said. I'm trying to get on your page. I'm trying to see your business from this perspective. And I think, the last thing I'll say is starting one of those conversations with a little frame around what your job is and what you're trying to do. I'm trying to build a culture of integrity to de-risk the organization and improve the bottom line. I'm trying to do something to really unleash this business so we can run down the road faster without going out of bounds. I want to make sure I understand your business and so what are the biggest risks you see in your business? You know what I'm saying? That kind of a conversation where you're really open to their input and their influence is going to build a lot of trust, because there's been studies that have shown that the number one key to influencing someone else is them believing that you're open to their influence. So if you can start that relationship and you can start that interaction by being open to that influence, it's really going to compress the time. It's going to let you time travel in terms of the connection you're able to make.
So I wanted now to shift gears to one of compliance officers' favorite subjects at all times, is how compliance deals with the legal team. And in fact, we did have a audience question here about does what we are discussing, compliance officer having influence, does that reinforce the idea that the CCO should be separate from the general counsel? I had been thinking more in terms of how the compliance team relates to legal, because if you report into them, at least in theory, they could be a barrier to you exerting influence. If you don't report in to legal, they could be a rival for influence. I'm not necessarily sure. I know that implicit in all of that is that compliance and legal aren't friends when ideally they should be. But we have a lot that we could cover there. Melanie, let me put it to you first. What do you think about, I don't know, should CCOs be separate from legal to be able to exert influence, or do they need to be, or what should we keep in mind? And then I'll go to Hema and Lisa Beth and Nick down the line. But what are your thoughts about that relationship? Because it's tricky.
Well, I mean, I think I have an interesting take on it because I'm not an attorney. So, so to preface my statement by saying, I've never been both. I've always been separate from in all of my CCO roles from the GC. And, I think in my experience, I've always felt like it was a very complementary situation where, we both brought different things to the table, and maybe, I can only speak as myself, right? But maybe that's because I don't see myself as doing their job at all. But I've always experienced us as being able to be a team because we have different strategic goals, and so we can work together to protect the company kind of in different ways. And so I've always found it to be good teamwork. And I also think that, from the OIG perspective or the DOJ perspective, there is, they are supposed to be different. And I think for that reason is that really, when it comes right down to it, there could be a conflict of interest at some point where, one person is trying to protect a company legally and one person is trying to guide a company from an ethical standpoint. So I think it's healthy for them to be separate. I think it also is better for both professions that we speak to our power and what we are good at, so that we both maintain the importance of our roles within an organization. I think especially when economic times are hard, it's at least my observation that sometimes the roles are getting combined for cost savings. And that is not something I think is healthy for either profession. So I think that the best thing we can do is to work well together and demonstrate our unique values, that it stays as two independent roles.
All right. Hema, what do you think? And then Lisa Beth.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with a lot of what Mel said there. There's certainly benefits of those two functions working very closely together. We also know that the conflict of interest is a real concern. I think the regulators are quite clear that they expect there to be some division. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's plenty of guidance that they should be separate functions. And if not, there should be a dotted line, as I mentioned. That said, the one thing I think one conflict that can present is if the general counsel, the broader legal function, is really thinking of just business growth and thinking of compliance as the Office of Mitigation, Risk Management, and Office of No. One benefit of working together is that I think that the GC and the CCO come together, both unlocking business opportunities, unlocking responsible growth. I like to say, we will help you. You will choose where you're flying, how high you want to go, the direction you're going, and build the airplane. We will help you take off, fly, and land safely. And if we're doing that together effectively, we're all unlocking business. What I think can be really challenging is when there does need to be a check and balance, and somebody needs to say, hey, we found a problem and we need to fix it. And actually, there may be other forces in the legal team that say, well, we don't really want to talk about the problems. We don't want to admit anything's wrong. We don't want to document guilt. So I think there's a little bit there where the compliance profession is taught to almost be grateful when we see a problem and someone speaks up to us and think about what we can do about it. There may be, let's say, employment law. You can imagine, let's not admit anything. Let's stay silent. Let's say nothing. So I think those are the tensions. I like to call them healthy tensions. We know as compliance professionals, if there's tension, friction, we're doing our job well. And the beauty is how we work together to resolve those together. Again, doing hard things well together, let's say.
Let me ask this question. Would it be fair to say that the legal team's bigger objective is to avoid liability? And I only ask that because you say, well, let's not document that we have this problem. But I often think compliance is there to reduce liability, that, if we just do things the way that we should, we aren't going to get in trouble. I mean, is it fair to just draw that distinction between avoiding and reducing liability? I sometimes wonder, is that where the tension comes from?
It's a fair question. I think you're right that the ideal goal, the good intention, is to prevent right? Not detect. But we are in the business of prevent and detect. And again, the operational reality may be that there is a cycle of that. There are some things you need to detect and deal with. And so if we're coming at it to prevent, but actually, there's a force that says we'll just need to protect the liability right now, I think we've got to think about those tensions. That's why I think it's beautiful to have both. Mel's quite right. There is a trend of having CLOs sit with the CCO functions, many that probably in our audience that do both. But as long as you can straddle that line and understand that protecting the company is sometimes working really hard to prevent future issues.
Okay. And Lisa Beth, let me get your thoughts on this too, including a late-breaking question, somebody asking, how do you fight lawyer bias, that the thought that the compliance officer must be an attorney? Lisa Beth, what would you say to that? Melanie already gave a good answer that she wasn't an attorney. She's been doing this for years. But what's your take?
So I am an attorney. I've been an attorney the whole time I've been in my, kind of professional working career. And I think, just to take a step back, it's really about the skills and talents that someone brings to the table. And there are people who can do lots of things and do lots of things well. There are people who are very, very focused subject matter experts and are great at that one thing. And then there are people who are just extremely facile and able to do lots of different things. I don't think that the goal of the law department is to eliminate risk. Like it's a fool's errand to think that we can eliminate risk or prevent risk entirely. You don't have a business if all you're doing is preventing risk, right? We are all in the service of the organizations that we work for and coming at it with a risk-based mindset and also working together. I don't see the conflict. I've not seen conflict between compliance and legal. We are in very interesting times and we have lots of different skills to bring to the table. And frankly, I think there is a place for absolutely everyone in compliance, 100%. You're in marketing, we can use you in compliance. You're in healthcare, we definitely can use you in compliance. You're an educator, you whatever it is that you bring to the table, those unique skills and attributes are perfect for this profession. We need more of everyone's talents, everyone's thoughts. And I don't see that there's a conflict unless you make one. And when you make one, that's when you have a dysfunctional system anyway.
I mean, to build on what Lisa Beth is saying, because I totally echo that there's room for everyone in this profession. To the person who asked the question, I don't know whether that's someone who is like myself, maybe not an attorney and feels sometimes like at a disadvantage. But I think building on what Lisa Beth said, I have been able to express that, I actually started in healthcare as a clinician. And then I worked as an operational leader, and then in QA and the great Plinko board of life before I ended up in compliance. And so to me, I've been able to present that as an advantage and say, I have empathy and insight for those that I am trying to, help with compliance. I've been the operator who's sometimes had to listen to compliance advice and do my training and when I'm busy in the field. And, I understand that. And I've had to manage productivity and a P&L. So I understand how it feels to be doing that and have to do it compliantly. So I think no matter what your background is, you said, Lisa Beth, if you're an educator or you're a marketer or whatever your background is, great, because then you have some unique insights that you can bring to the compliance role. And so I think you should express your different background as an advantage, not as a disadvantage.
See that you're just naturally influential. You're just naturally persuasive. I think you're right. I think it's all about it's going to be idiosyncratic overcoming that lawyer bias, and it's about making the case for yourself. It's not 1996 anymore. There's been enough examples of other highly successful compliance officers, chief compliance officers, whatever, that don't have that sort of standard background. And to your point, I mean, what's the goal? The goal is to have an effective program. The goal is to effectively build a culture of integrity and de-risk the organization to improve the bottom line and let that business grow faster. And so it's all about kind of the case you can make. Mel, in your case, you had this sort of bouquet of a background that was very unique that allowed you to probably make the case pretty easily that, hey, I have these insights. I've walked in these shoes. I've lived in these trenches. And so the odds of me being, effective are probably going to be a lot higher even though I don't have that degree, you know?
I also wanted to ask, and we had a couple of different listeners also chime in on this, ask your thoughts about the importance of simply talking about ethics and core values of the company as a way to exert influence. And I will first say, I remember many years ago, a good compliance officer I know, Steve Coslow, who is now these days at Allianz, but he had the Coslow rule that if he had 1 hour to only talk about ethics or compliance, ethics every time, because if I get that right, my compliance stuff gets a lot easier. I do agree with that. On the other hand, I talk a lot about ethics to my 2 young children downstairs, and yet I still find I must implement some fierce internal controls because it doesn't stick. And I wonder how much that is also true at corporate organizations. And, you know, how do you find the right balance between talking about the bigger ethical values, and yet some people are going to roll their eyes and violate it anyways, and we're going to have to implement the compliance controls. You know, Melanie, let me ask you first, and maybe then Hema and Lisa Beth. What do you think about the role that ethics plays here, and how much of an ingredient is that supposed to be in the recipe?
Well, I mean, I've spent most of my compliance career in healthcare, which is highly regulated. So you're going to have some hard and fast rules that, you know, are hopefully based on ethical decision making. But I think you're always going to, in any high risk industry, whether, you know, you work in aeronautics or, you know, you work in pharmaceuticals, or you work, you know, wherever you are, where, you know, if you make this mistake, really bad things are going to happen, or really expensive things are going to happen. So you have to have some basic understanding of the rules of the road from a compliance standpoint. But then, as you said, I think having values as an organization, and I think part of having the values is that everyone at that organization feels a certain just personal responsibility and affinity towards the organization. You know, that's the thing that makes you proud to be there and want to do the right thing, which I certainly think is the underpinning of then following the rules that have to be set. So I think, you know, the culture goes far beyond just the compliance rules. The ethics portion of the culture has to encompass a lot of other things about what that company stands for and how people treat one another and the world at large. And so you want to be somewhere where you feel good about that. But then we do have to have, and by the way, you can't do these things because that's the rules of the road. That would be my take on that.
Hema and then Lisa Beth, what do you think about this?
I like to make the framing between minimum viable compliance and maybe what you can get away with, and then what is the right thing. And I think that, you know, it's hard to define ethics and legal there, but that's kind of where I put it. And I like to then, it's very, very interesting to talk about what the right thing is and how you operationalize that in any one moment, because the law can be black and white. You know, it can, you know, license to operate, what you can and cannot get in trouble for, what can put you in jail or affect your livelihood or affect your reputation. But when it comes to ethical decision making, that's something that you have to think about every day. I think that's something that you want to be facilitating as a compliance professional. So I would, to your first question, I would probably choose ethics every time, because you can get the compliance piece. I'd probably put that really nicely in a policy. But what feels like a gray area sometimes, or what feels like looking at different stakeholders' perspectives and doing the right thing, even though you're not legally required to, I think that can generate some really interesting stories, some really interesting case points to discuss. So I certainly like to have that conversation. It's certainly why I'm in the business, to think at scale about how people can make ethical decisions in any situation. So I take the challenge. I would definitely choose the ethics over the compliance. It's safe in the knowledge that we've got the compliance written down somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And Lisa Beth, your turn. What do you think here?
Yeah, so in terms of what I would talk about, it would definitely be the ethics. But in terms of what I would do, it would be setting the process and procedure for compliance, because people keep peopling, right? This is why people have difficulty in maybe making life changes. Like if you have somebody who's a diabetic who doesn't like to eat, you know, anything but carbs and sugar, right? Carbs and sugar taste great. Like everybody loves carbs and sugar, but if we eat carbs and sugar all the time, then we have some problems. And it's the same thing with the people that we're dealing with. Like if you spend any time reading like Atomic Habits, that's all about how do you make the things that you know are right and good for you easier to do. That's what compliance is here to do. Like you want people to understand the ethical, like what is the right answer? We know the right answer a lot of the time, but it's easier to do the thing that's easy, which sometimes isn't the compliant behavior that we want. So I say always talk about ethics. We want people to be really clear on what the right answer is, but spend your time on the compliance, on setting the boundaries. And that's what you're doing with your kids too. Like you tell them what the right thing is to do. They know it. And yet you have to put in those boundaries because otherwise they go back to the easier behaviors that don't necessarily serve their long-term, futures, what you've asked them to do, or, any of that. So I think it's a both and, but the way that we spend our time is a little bit different based on what we're looking to do.
Yeah. And I mean, how much more persuasive are those boundaries when they're tied back to those underlying values, right? Like if you can connect those sort of compliance things, those rules or whatever, back to those values, it does help to kind of connect them and see that one is just a mere extension of the other in a particular circumstance or something.
So here's a question from the audience, and I'll just throw this out again to anybody who is game to answer it. Basically asking for some war stories, I think, about some specific barriers to exerting influence that you may have encountered and how you overcame them. Anybody have any particular vivid memories that you'd want to share with the class here today about practical barriers you've encountered and how you solved them?
I got one I was on the other end of. So I was trying to be this was several years ago. We had someone who was helping us out on a fractional basis with compliance. And so I'll just tell you, they were coming in with kind of, it felt like a sledgehammer. And I just felt like, very quickly, I was like, this person has no idea what they're talking about. And I had this like aversion of being influenced by them because I just felt like there was no context around what they were trying to prescribe. Like you don't understand the business. You don't understand like what our risk tolerance is. You don't understand like what our play and our angle is for this stage of our growth. And I just think it was a really low credibility conversation from my standpoint. And I was like totally closed off to it. And there were probably some good ideas in there. So we fixed that. We've gotten some new help, but I was just on the other side of what I would call like a ham-handed approach or an attempt to influence without context that I think felt really flat.
Yeah, I had an early career.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say I had an early fail, very similar to that, where I went in. This is before I learned my first 90 days lesson, and I went in to a company who never had a compliance program before, and I thought I'm just gonna gung-ho, gonna get this done, and I wanted to implement compliance education. This was a company that had a large team of workers who were out in the field. And I did what I thought seemed like a good idea to get that education accomplished. And I picked a couple different days and scheduled multiple times for the sessions so that it could be live training and they could pick a time that was convenient to them and do it. And the day before this was all set to happen, the director of that field group just unilaterally canceled the whole thing. Well, what I hadn't done was talk to that director ahead of time and find out, what do you think the best way to reach your team would be, and how can we set this up in a way that will be successful operationally? And it was a moment, and thankfully, we had an uncomfortable but productive conversation about, kind of what occurred then, and we set it right. And I, righted my wrongs and said, in the future, I'm going to make sure I collaborate. But in the future, I hope you'll also talk to me before maybe you cancel something unilaterally that I've put a lot of work into. And we ended up being good friends and colleagues, but it was a moment, where I had the steam curling out of my ears. And before I could acknowledge my fault in the situation, I was just really pissed off. So, if I had just taken the time to listen up front and collaborate up front, probably could have avoided the whole thing. So,
all right.
Great story. That must have been so frustrating.
Oh my God, I was ready. Her office shared a wall with mine. and yet
So
this
you're
all
yelling
went
into a
down.
pillow or something, yeah.
Yeah, but like epic fail on my own part in retrospect, you know?
Lisa Beth or Hema, do you have any other sort of practical examples of problems you've encountered, how to overcome them?
I've got one that I think probably many of our audience encounter, which is no matter how well you think you're doing your job, when it comes to reporting to the board or the audit committee, you're going to be given 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes max to whether quarterly or annually report what you need to. And so you can always ask for more minutes, but we all know how that's going to go, right? Because it's a long day. What I've realized is if you can make your work more pervasive, and so if there's something that needs to be said about a certain topic by a certain function, I don't need to be the one saying it in my 5 minutes. I can have the business be talking about the way they've managed the risk, the litigation risk, the practical risk, and how they're mitigating it, what resources they might need in their portion. So I found it very, very helpful to think of it that way, like be a problem solver. I don't need to squeeze more into my presentations or my time. Maybe I won't one day need the time because I've facilitated risk management by the various functional owners, because it's a long day for the empathy, it's a long day for the board members. But there's a reason it's a long day. They're seeing every one of my risk owners at some point. And so I found that it was much more persuasive to be pervasive. And that's just one practical obstacle I have to deal with every time. And thinking in advance, I have to think, how can I get that message pervasive through the meeting rather than in my minutes?
That is an excellent idea. Lisa Beth, anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, so I love Hema's amplification technique, which is be pervasive so that it comes through everywhere and it doesn't have to come through you. But the example that I could think of is there was a leader that I had that I was just having such a hard time connecting with. And what I figured out is that leader always wanted to talk about the data and the numbers, and couldn't kind of have a social conversation before we got to the meaty topic. And I am much more of an extrovert, and I'm a person who's saying, hey, how are you doing? How was your weekend? And for whatever reason, that was not that person's bag of tea. Like, I don't have to be everybody's person, right? But ultimately, I had to be able to flex my style so that I could meet that person where they were at. And that was one of the most challenging things that I had to deal with, which was figuring out sometimes the style that we automatically come with is not the style that's needed in that moment. And being able to connect with a person based on their needs is more important than what I need to say. I need to connect with them first to be able to have permission to lead, license to lead to the right answers in the other areas.
Well, they have to be open, to your point. Right.
Here's a question from the audience that leads into something I'd wanted to raise anyways. They're asking, what would you do to assure that the business units think that compliance is a friend and not a foe? And I'm going to guess that your answers there would be something along the lines of showing the business how compliance can help them and add some value. And I was hoping that all of the panelists could maybe give some thoughts about how compliance teams can demonstrate that they can help the business, they can help the business succeed, they can help teams. But I was particularly interested in, would your answers to that question, here's how I add value to you, is that different for the operating units in the first line and for the management units up top? Melanie, what do you think first? And then maybe Lisa Beth and Hema, and then Nick.
Yeah, it's interesting because Nick and I worked on some presentations that we've done a few of them. We called it a extreme compliance makeover, trying to change your spiel so that you can show your ROI when you're asking for budget or making a proposal to a business unit. So we spent a lot of time thinking about these kinds of things. And, so I spend a lot of time, as you might imagine, working with an investment team, a bunch of, finance people, and getting a voice at that table. For instance, you could talk about how a compliance issue could impact quality of earnings, right? So if you are evaluating a business, but the business is making its money in some way that is in violation of compliance. So say, they're billing in a way that you cannot bill for a medical service, or they're using personnel who are not licensed, so can't bill for a certain service with Medicare, and you find that out, well, guess what? Their earnings are going to be significantly lower if they have to up-level their workforce to be appropriately skilled, or if they can't bill as many units as they're currently billing. So, understanding that someone is doing something compliantly can be very connected to what you think you're getting when you partner with an organization. So I think speaking of compliance in terms that resonate and use the same vocabulary and make sense to whoever it is that you need to be on board with what you're doing is really important. And I think, we can be tone deaf sometimes, just saying, well, that's the way you have to do it, and not thinking about how do I explain why you have to do it this way in a way that will matter to my listener is where we come up short. So, that would be an example that I would give. That's at a higher level, for dealing with a business team or executive team.
Lisa Beth, what would you say about that, and some ideas on how to demonstrate to various parts of the enterprise?
I wrote an entire chapter on this, which is how to communicate with your audience in mind. When you put the audience first, everything falls in line. So you have to understand your audience, know what they are trying to do, and then you can shape your message to get to the ultimate outcome that you are looking for. But it's always like, if there's a balancing act here and it's your message versus what the audience needs to hear, audience wins every single time. And you have to understand where your audience is at. So, the first line is going to be at a very different type of communication level than your second line, right? Is going to be very different than your board of directors, right? Because they have different responsibilities and they have different, access, different visibility to what's going on. They speak differently in their everyday because they're focused on different things. So really tailor those messages. You may have the same thing to say, like, don't bribe, but the way that you say it and the way that you contextualize it and bring it to your audience has to be foundationally different, which is why I am much more of a fan of having very targeted communications to specific populations, using their language and becoming a great studier of everything that happens in their day-to-day. Because otherwise it's just either going to fly by them. It's not going to make sense. They're going to discount it because it seems like it's so alien to them, because they are on planet the Ethicsverse, and you are somewhere way far away from where they are.
So Hema and then Nick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so look, to piggyback on that, obviously meet them where they are. I think we've heard that today as well. I think I wrote in the chat, make your goals their goals, right? So, or actually make their goals your goals is actually the way to say it. So you can only know their goals if you're listening in the way that Lisa Beth has described. You can only know their goals if you're radically curious about what they need to do. And then you help them meet those goals in that way. Compassion and empathy as well are very important here, because you've got to understand the circumstances in which they're operating, the conditions in which they're operating. Maybe it's pressure to meet numbers. Maybe it's pressure to meet objectives and key results that quarter. Maybe they've got a project that is overdue and needs to be finished. You've got to think about what they need to do and how you can help them get there. I like to call our function the office of unlock. What do I mean by that? It's the exact opposite of the office of no, number one, but it's also unlocking your business opportunities, because remember, right, risk is the other side of the coin when it comes to opportunity. So why not talk more about opportunity, get people excited about what they want to do, where they want to arrive. And as I said, if they want to fly a plane, all I'm doing is trying to clear the runway for them and help them get there faster and more safely. That's really what we're doing. I have been in businesses where we will not go into markets for fear of the risks. It's just too risky, let's not even bother. But with a good conversation about controls, mitigation, a responsible approach, a good faith defensible narrative, you can unlock those markets, those industries for your company. And so, for example, if the goal is to unlock government work, public sector work using third parties, well, all of us anti-corruption experts are like, whoa, we should be in the room. The beauty is, if that's the goal, you can show how you can get them there and unlock those markets for them. So I would always say, be the office of unlock. Get really curious about their objectives. They're human beings with their own needs, fears, and worries. They're really not interested about your compliance training stats or even your hotline usage. They really just want to get on with their day job. And if you have that massive empathy and compassion, and you are somebody that is truly partnering with them, how can I help you today move along? I know for the different audiences, so obviously that works then. If you're checking the goal of the specific audience, you're doing well. Let's use an example. Maybe on the front line, somebody wants to show they have a well thought out plan for the next project. You can help them with the risk mitigation piece of that plan, right? But maybe at the highest levels, we want to know that we're going to meet our goals of unlocking business and getting X number of dollars. We've been able to show on specific deals how compliance was able to satisfy a customer with their compliance concerns so that the deal could be unlocked, thus opening new markets, thus opening new industries. That's a story you want to tell. Right? There are ways, there are awards you can get for that kind of impact at scale. And so I think the compliance teams need to recognize there is a role, just like there is for the person drafting the contract. There's a role for the person answering the due diligence questionnaire. The customer would not have put their money towards us if we hadn't unlocked that business with them. So anyway, I digress, but just to say, if you're speaking in the language of the business and you are genuinely interested in helping them, making their goals your goals, you can't lose.
And I think when you do that, yeah, sorry to jump in here, but like when you do that, Hema, you kind of can open your eyes a little bit to what resources you have that might be able to be applied to these folks to demonstrate, like Matt was asking, some actual usefulness or some actual, improvement. You know what I'm saying? So like one example would be most everybody has some kind of enterprise-wide speak up line or something like that. Adding a category for a particular campaign around safety for manufacturing or something, and going to that operations leader and saying, hey, we have this tool. It's already kind of in place. This is no extra spend, particularly sidebar if you're trying to influence this person or get their buy-in for something, leading with that kind of give to give mentality and saying, hey, what if we did a little campaign that we could help you out with? We can add a category to our intake, and then we can send you these reports and send you this risk intelligence. I stole this from you, or maybe let me borrow it. But if our job is to crowdsource that risk intelligence at scale, and we're doing that right, and we have a ton of risk intelligence, it's very easy to demonstrate our value to other departments because we have information that they don't have. So to the extent we're able to provide that and give them an insight to help them see around the curve or help them see a smoldering fire that might later turn into a raging inferno, those are easy gives to demonstrate I'm committed to this thing, your goals are my goals, I'm trying to be the office of unlock, all those kinds of things.
So we're pretty much at the end here. We have about 3 minutes left. And so I just wanted to throw out a final question, which unfortunately we'll have to cap everybody's answers at about 30, 45 seconds or so.
Well, actually, Matt, sorry to interrupt. So we're going to stay on and keep talking. If you want to hop off, that's cool. So like we'll go through some of these other questions for a couple of minutes after. So no pressure to stick around. I might just be speaking to an empty room. Doesn't matter. Okay.
But my final question for everybody is, what does the final victory look like here? If you have achieved your nirvana state of being an influencer, you can do what? Or you've arrived there because of X. Maybe like Melanie, Lisabeth, and Hema, I'll just go right down the line. What would you say the final victory looks like?
I mean, I think you have succeeded when you become a trusted advisor across the board, not just in your narrow compliance swim lane. And I think it's the beauty of compliance is you have an opportunity to do that because you get to know everyone in the business if you're doing it well. And your CEO kind of can even look to you as kind of that neutral third party because you don't have a sales goal or a finance goal. You're just there to help the organization unlock opportunities in a compliant way, but all the players in an unbiased kind of way. And that you are that trusted advisor when you start getting the, hey, I'd really appreciate your thoughts on X and it has nothing to do with anti-kickback for once. So I think that's when that you've succeeded in your pursuit of influence is when you are an influential advisor across the board.
All right. And then Lisabeth and then Hema, how would you answer that question too?
Very similar to what Melanie is saying. You're the supernode. Like you have arrived when you're the supernode, right? You are the one that everybody wants to check in with because they know that you're looking around corners. You're the one who wants everybody to succeed, and that the best way to get to a good outcome is to have you be part of it. Mm-hmm. Once you're at that space, then I think that you have arrived. But I never say that's the final destination, because you're unlocking a world of opportunities, not just for the organization, but for yourself. And as we continue to grow and develop in our own careers, develop our portfolio of what our life is, this just is opening up so many different areas for us to consider: expansion, changes, etc. And this profession, it never stops changing. So we never actually arrive. We just are in a good place for today and then growing for tomorrow.
All right. And then Hema, what's your take?
Oh, that's hard to follow. I so agree with everything you said. I would say my actual nirvana would obviously be that you wouldn't need any of us as ethics and compliance professionals, because everybody understands what they need to do, right? But the reason that will never be the case is what Lisbeth just said so elegantly, that nothing is static. Everything is changing faster than it can. And we need to be, I know agile is not the word anymore, athletic, nimble. We all need to be that. We need to understand that opportunities will abound. And we think about the industrial revolution that is AI. We've got so much exciting work to do now together with our businesses to learn. And so I think for me, I'm going to go then to my proudest moment, which again echoes what's been said. One of my proudest moments was when I was brought in at the beginning of an objective setting. It's like, we would like to do this new thing. And Hema needs to be there then, not at the end when something's gone wrong, or, when I finally get around to meeting them in a one-on-one. No, this was compliance needs to be in the room before we even consider this opportunity. That to me is arriving, at least in the small sense of the word. But yes, arrival will be when we've all worked ourselves out of a job, because everybody understands they're the risk owners and they know what to do.
All right. So for all listeners who wanted to be here for the hour is up. But as Nick said, we are going to stick around and answer some more questions for a while. I would just give everybody who's listening another heads up that don't forget we have our keynote session coming up shortly, I think at the top of the hour, which is going to delve into government investigations. So even if you do have to log off for a bit, log back on in time for that. That's going to be a good one. Nick, I also am going to log off to prepare for the keynote session that I'll be moderating. But if you all want to go answer some of the other audience questions, this has been a great session. And
let's have one more tsunami of emojis for Matt Kelly. Phenomenal panel, Matt. This chat was blowing up. Thank you so much, man. We'll see you in about a half an hour. We're going to dive back through a couple more of these questions. So any of you guys who can stay, great. I'd love to walk through these. Man, this panel has been phenomenal. Look at the emojis. New record, 57 so far. 5,700, almost at 58. New record. This is blowing me away today.
I love it.
Okay, let's start with this question. Okay, this is from Doug. Hey, Doug. We're hearing about compliance a lot and love to hear your perspective on the difference between compliance and ethics. We touched on this a little bit, but really kind of try to dive into the fact that SEC does not regulate ethics. Who looks for it and how does one influence that?
I would give a little caveat there. The SEC rules require that you have a code of ethics. So there is some regulation there if you're a public company. But, I think that there are lots of differences between compliance and ethics. Compliance is, meeting the objectives that you have, right? So whether it's regulatory objectives or expectations that you've set or different standards that you have aligned yourself to, whether it's, UN Global Compact or whatever, compliance is making sure that you're hitting the mark on what you have communicated out to the rest of the world, your stakeholders, as it were. That you are going to be doing, whether it's, PCI compliance because you're in the payment card industry, which is, not a law. It is a, industry standard. Ethics goes well beyond that to say, what is aligned to our values? And that's where it's very different company by company, right? You have some companies that say that we're always going to have customers at our center. Everything we do is in service of X, Y, and Z. So understanding your organization's ethics is important to be able to do everything beyond mere compliance. But sometimes you have your compliance help to enforce what the ethics are of the organization. So I really think it's a blended, environment where you need both and.
Yeah, I agree with that. Listen to this question. This is kind of related. And I'd love to hear from you on this one, Mel. So what do you do? I mean, because you've just dealt with so many different business leaders across, your role right now and looking at all these companies and doing that diligence. I'm sure you're doing diligence on a bunch of companies that you don't even end up closing on, right? So what about dealing with a CRO or a board that is against, CEO perhaps, that is against preventative measures, and they say that we're just willing to take the risk? How do you kind of sort through that, and how do you sort of get comfortable with perhaps a different sort of subjective level of like risk tolerance than you might personally have?
Well, I mean, I think I always see our role as, I like to explain it as a bell curve, right? At one end of the bell curve, you have do this and you go to jail, right? I don't think anyone wants to go to jail, but I don't think most people realistically think that's going to happen to them. So that's an interesting question. Then at the other end, you have here, you could do anything you want, but there's really high risk to the company of, it's like, here's, so one end you go to jail, one end there's no risk, sorry. One end is jail, one end is no risk. But then if you're taking no risk, it probably is very difficult to get business done and make a profit because you're very narrowly conscribed, right? So in the middle of the bell curve, there's lots of options, right? There's lots of, you could do this, or this, and each of those things carries with it some degree of risk. And it might be reputational risk, or it might be regulatory risk, or financial risk. There's, and I think it's our job to do the best we can to accurately inform leaders of the risk involved with whatever it is they're trying to do. And then they have to make a business decision about what it is which path they're going to take. Now, as a compliance officer, within an organization, if you are consistently having leaders make choices that make you feel very uncomfortable, then maybe you're in the wrong spot for you, because maybe your risk tolerance is so different from that organization's risk tolerance that it's going to make you miserable, right? Or concerned for your reputation or your career, and then you have to rethink. But I think most leaders that I have worked with are very responsive to that conversation because they understand that you see nuance too, that there isn't just, jail and no money. There's options, and you can help them understand the risk benefit ratio of those options. And I have, in most of my experiences, found it to be a very productive conversation where we can all work together to do the best we can to mitigate the risk around whatever choice we make. And work together collaboratively. So I think that approach works really well.
I think business people are trying to take calculated risks. They're not just trying to they're not risk seeking per se. They're trying to take calculated risks. And I think, you can have a debate around what the likelihood of a particular outcome, you can debate how likely something is from happening. But in my experience, kind of to echo what you're saying, Mel, I think most folks, if they think it's an actual risk, and it's particularly if it's one that hasn't been on their radar and they haven't considered, they're usually open to talking about it and at least kind of picking it up and seeing like, okay, is this something that I need to, have in the forefront of my mind, or can we put it on the back burner?
Well, and this is where HEMA's Department of Unlock comes in,
exactly.
I think, where you can say like, yes, here's the risk. Here's what we as compliance can do to help you protect yourself from that risk so that you can still take that route, but maybe consider these options for controlling the risk. And then you're a partner,
Right.
Anything to add, Hema or Lisa
Well,
Beth?
I think we should be very proud of giving fully informed choices, right? I mean, as Mel quite rightly says, it's not our choice. With the risk tolerance and risk appetite, we are there as full partners and advisors, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that it's our choice to make. That's a business judgment. We can help to document the risk appetite and tolerance for sure, right? We can help with that as necessary. But, I would go the other way. Don't assume the risk tolerance or the risk appetite and not give fully informed choices out of fear, right? Remember your job to fearlessly give that information so people can make a fully informed choice. Be the calculator, perhaps, right? If a calculated risk is needed, help with the calculations, but be humble and be realistic. I hate, honestly, motivating through fear. I know I worked at the SEC as a prosecutor, but it's just not fun telling people I'm keeping you out of an orange jumpsuit. It's just not fun.
That's for parenting. Right? It's for parenting.
Yeah. And it doesn't work. It maybe works the first time to open your eyes, but it doesn't give you credibility. And so back to what the opportunity cost is, what the cost of compliance might be. What's the gain here, and what's the potential cost, and is it net going to land you anywhere? Just back to a prior question as well. I think it is helpful to explain or remind of the reputational issue, the brand hit as well, because we could talk about the bottom line, but now we're not really worried about the regulators chasing us, worried about Twitter and X and Facebook. That's really where you're going to get hit now. And so if you work somewhere where your brand is important to you, we can also be brand shields and brand protection advisors. So I think we've got a lot of tools in our armor to, very confidently give fully informed choices, but we're not supposed to be there as righteous, indignant people that think we know better. And again, Mel's right. If you start to feel that way too much, maybe you're onto something, but just remember what your role is. Your role is to give the fully informed choice and do that with a clear conscience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people want to become this trusted advisor in the organization. And the answer is in the word, to your point, like we're advising. And so a good advisor is going to allow you to see further around the curve than you can on your own and see, risks, perhaps, again, a better calculation of those risks, better trade-offs across options. And again, I think that provides a ton of value for anyone in any circumstance. Like if you're coaching someone like a life coach or something like that, what are you providing? You're providing guidance and you're providing insight and perspective for a particular decision or a particular event for that individual, but you're not giving that speech or you're not firing that person or you're not going for that promotion. You're providing some perspective and some things to think about. That is of tremendous value. We're in a really unique position to provide that value to the organization. And again, we're right there to, small tweak, become that true trusted advisor. Sorry, Lisa Beth, I cut you off.
I was going to say, I'm going to be a little bit provocative here.
Let's go.
Because it's Friday Junior and we're going to have a conversation.
Let's go,
But I think that one of our jobs is to always be on the edge of discomfort. I think that unless you are uncomfortable, at least some of the times, either the business has ceded too much authority to compliance and they should be taking some of it back, or you are not thinking deeply enough and working hard enough to make sure that the business is taking appropriate risk. So I think that, part of our job is to find ways to manage in what should be slight discomfort. It should never be so terribly uncomfortable that you're like, I can't continue here anymore. Then it's your time to leave. But you should be slightly uncomfortable and be willing to have uncomfortable conversations regularly as part of the job. Otherwise, you are not stretching and growing enough and the business is not, moving in the ways that it needs to.
That's a really important point. It's like if you're not building, you're like deteriorating. If you're not like getting stronger, you're getting weaker. And in order to continue to get stronger, you have to continue to put like stress on your muscles, just to use the analogy, which is uncomfortable. So if you're not living in that uncomfort, then you're not riding that hard. You know what I'm saying? Like, how could you be?
If you're playing it too safe, you're not growing in the way that you need to for the future that we're all about to face.
That's right. So we were talking a little bit about using headlines to kind of influence a little bit. And so Wendy asked, hey, Wendy, how's it going? Do you get pushback on this approach of using headlines to persuade leadership, such as, for example, the business saying, well, we're not them. That could never happen here. So they tune it out and they don't appreciate the lessons on how it could or how it has happened at your organization or in your industry or something like that?
I think headlines should be used judiciously, because what I find is that oftentimes they are very easy to grab. They often aren't necessarily all that comparable. So it's very easy for people to say, oh, that could never be me because I'm not, opening up 15 million bank accounts when somebody hasn't asked me to. And it's one tool. It is one tool in a toolkit that should be filled with all so many different ways of how to get your point across and how to tell the story. The doom and gloom, like the sky is falling, that works like maybe once, but you have to have lots of different ways to land messages. So like be very judicious with it, because I think it's all too easy to discount.
I agree.
I think it'd be good for, sorry, go ahead, Emma.
No, okay. Look, Christine says headlines need to be relevant. I'd say you need to go beyond the headline. A headline is just that, right? But if you look a little bit deeper, you can often see whether it's relevant or not, number one. Definitely be prepared to answer the question, how is this relevant to me, right? It doesn't end there. And oftentimes, if you're coming with a headline, it's because you find something that's relevant. I like to say, oh, look, this happened to a competitor. this won't happen to us because of this, but we're vulnerable here, right? You get the information in the press release, right? Look, they got a lower. Oh, they only got 2 million instead of 200 million. Why was that? Oh, look, they had these things in place. We only have 3 of those 6 things in place. Maybe we should focus there. Right? There's a better conversation to be had in the text under the headline. And if you don't want to use the press, go to the SEC or the DOJ press release. They'll tell you exactly what they either gave cooperation credit for or required the monitor to focus on. So you can get some really good information. And that, by the way, if you use that tactic, it doesn't even have to be a competitor in the same industry. You can just say, look, this company is also trying to fly in that direction, in that place, in this method. And we're trying to do the same thing. We can learn from their experience. And then again, remember, fully informed choices. You're not blackmailing your C-suite saying you must do it because it happened. Right. You're just saying, here's some fresh information about the way the enforcement agencies are behaving right now, the risks in the market. These are the things that can help us be fully informed. So I would say headlines are super helpful if you are using them with relevance, to Christine's point. And, as Lisa Beth explained, it's not one tool. It's just one source of information and risk intelligence in your arsenal.
In zooming out of this conversation, I just would like everyone to kind of notice how each of these panelists were so naturally persuasive. Like, Hema, the way you said that, you said, hey, look at this. Oh, why did they not have that? Why did they get this reduction? Oh, because they had X, Y, and Z. We have X, Y, and Z, so we should be good to go, but we have a vulnerability here. That is like absorb, good information. Okay, now I can sort of hear about where we're vulnerable. Like, that's so persuasive. And the point I'm trying to make is that this is just a muscle. Influence, persuasion, it's just a muscle. It's just a reframe. It's just an unearthing of these instincts that are written into your DNA that you've exhibited throughout your entire life. And I think once you start kind of doing it, it starts to just naturally happen. And you can start to, your mind is a natural goal seek mechanism. It's naturally going to find ways to, provide the information in a persuasive way, like Hema just did. Another thing I would say about headlines, and I guess what I'm about to say is maybe applicable to any pieces of evidence or like persuasive like mechanisms you might be using, but it's this concept of an objection audit. And so if you've ever seen 8 Mile, that final scene when Eminem wins the whole rap battle, his entire verse was an objection audit. He was saying all the negative things that his opponent was going to say. And so when you're presenting something, if it's a headline related to a company that is not your same company, well, what are the 5 or 6 like objections someone is likely going to have there? Right. Leading with that and saying, hey, I saw this headline from, Acme Co. And look, we're in a little bit of a different industry and they have a little bit of a different footprint, but the overlap is this. Well, if I can rule out some of the things that they might say to like stiff arm what I'm about to present to them, well, then they're naturally going to be a little bit more open. It's naturally going to feel a little bit more balanced, and it's going to feel a lot more like a presentation of information versus me, cologne, cheap suit trying to sell you a lemon. You understand what I'm saying? Easy way to pull a little bit of some of those objections that they're likely going to say, and really framing out what you're delivering with those objections really opens up a lot more, and you don't get caught up in those weeds. All right, we got a couple other questions. If any of these questions in the question are jumping out to you guys, please let me know. I love that. Were you going to say something, Emma? I love this one. What do you recommend presenting to the board? What do you recommend presenting to the board to best use the 5 minutes you get with them that will capitalize on the value of your program? You got a 5-minute window with the board. How do you get the most persuasion bang for your buck?
I will jump in. Go ahead, Mel.
I was just going to say one of my colleagues, Shubha Lakshmanan, who works with me, did this great presentation, and she talked about how she's one of those people that needs to be super prepared, and she has everything she wants to say in mind, and she's been thrown a couple curveballs a couple times where you're supposed to have 20 minutes, and then as happens, the agenda runs long and you get 5, right? So she gave some really good advice, which I think is practical, which is have your 20-minute, your 15-minute, your 10-minute, your 5-minute plan, so that you've already thought through, if I only get 5 minutes, these are the 3, sentences that I need to make sure connect with this, board or whoever it is you're talking to. And I always use that advice from Shubha. I think it's super helpful.
Anything to add, Lisa Beth?
Yeah, I will. So I've been having lots of conversations about this because part of my responsibility right now is to put together board materials, and do not bore your committees with page turning of PowerPoints. You need to have your materials. You need to be prepared to be compelling, be brief, be brilliant, and then be gone. That is your job when you are in front of the board. And you have to take that seriously. You have to practice it as if you are practicing for the most important 5 minutes of your life, because this is where you have impact and influence with a very different audience than you're used to. And talk to your corporate secretary. You should know like who's in the room and what they care about most and what they're asking about and what they like to see and don't like to see in presentations. Do your research and come in prepared for your moment.
Yeah, look, I can't agree more. I say be brief, be relevant, be gone, but it's the same concept, right? You have to do, and if you can do it in one slide, you really should. What's the it? Do they really need stats? I mean, what do you really need to say? It can be, I'm not saying I'm the expert on this, but for me, it's the journey. Where are we on the journey? And what's next? Where have we been? What's the highlight? What's next? And move on. Again, I used to work at the UN, and I kid you not, all the work was done in the corridors. It was never done in the actual meeting. So again, if you have the opportunity to get FaceTime with your function leaders, with your C-suite, with the chair of the audit committee before you actually go to present, you'll get the work done. I'm not saying cheat and get more time. I'm saying make sure that you've done the work through the year so that when you get there, everybody knows what you're about to say. It's not, don't surprise anyone at audit committee or at the board. Please don't do that. That will upset people.
The time to build your brand is not in the midst of the battle. You know what I'm saying? In the midst of the firefight. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So don't.
I think a lot of people make the mistake of spending time talking about activities. You know, like you need to hone in. What's the essential message that you need them to receive about? We have a risk, and this is what we need to do to control it, or whatever your main message is. And you know, if you have a bunch of really impressive, you know, things that you've completed and stats that you want them to have, you can give it as a pre-read or an appendix, but don't spend time reading on that.
Amazing panel. We've never seen anything like this. 9,436 reactions. So this was just gems. You guys were just dropping gems on everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break and hop over to the next session. So you can go ahead and click that button on the bottom. One more round of applause for Mel, for Lisa Beth, and for Hema. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for coming. See you guys.